Membranes. Cell membranes are the walls of cells.
Explanation. 1. The plasma membrane consists of a lipid bilayer that is semipermeable. Differentially permeable allows nonpolar but stop-polar compounds. Semipermeable, allowing certain substances to pass through it but not others, especially allowing the passage of a solvent but not of certain solutes. 3. The plasma membrane controls the transport of materials entering and leaving the cell. 4. Cell membrane is chemically composed of lipids, 20 to 40%, and proteins, 60 to 80%. 1. In addition, there is small quantity of carbohydrates present. 2. In 1972, Singer and Nicholson proposed a most acceptable model for membranes called fluid mosaic model. 3. This model is in agreement with photograph of cell membrane by electron microscope. 4. This model explains that the membrane is like a sea of lipids in which protein are floating. They are made up of lipids, proteins and carbohydrates. The cell membrane is a semi-permeable barrier that controls what enters and leaves the cell. The cell membrane is made up of two layers, an outer layer called the phospholipid bilayer and an inner layer called the cytoskeleton. The phospholipid bilayer is composed of two layers, one facing inside the cell and one facing outside the cell. The cytoskeleton is composed of proteins that help maintain the shape and structure of the cell as well as provide support for organelles within it. A. Role of proteins. The globes of proteins are moving about in the sea of lipid molecules. Intrinsic proteins penetrate and bind tightly to the hydrophobic tails of lipid bilayer. Extrinsic proteins are loosely bound to the hydrophilic, polar, glycerol head surfaces which face the watery medium both inside and outside the cell. Intrinsic proteins extend completely through the double layer of lipids from one side to the other. Extrinsic proteins are on one side of the membrane. Carbohydrates extend out from the outer surface of the membrane and are attached either to membrane lipids as glycolipids or to proteins as glycoproteins. Role of glycolipids and glycoprotein. Lipids, proteins and carbohydrates are responsible for functional diversity of the membranes. Lipid bilayer makes the membrane differentially permeable barrier that allows the transport of non-ions. Extrinsic proteins function as receptor that receives the stimuli from the environment and thus inform the cell to respond. Membrane proteins makes it selectively permeable barrier. Integral proteins, also called as permeases, regulate diffusion, osmosis and membrane carbohydrates such as glycolipids and glycoproteins provide receptor sites that receive different types of stimuli like hormone receptor sites. Ours receive nerve impulses. Recognition of antigens thus informs the cell for response. Membrane carbohydrates are also responsible for endocytosis, i.e. phagocytosis, eating of the cell, and penocytosis, drinking of the cell. Intrinsic proteins extend completely through the double layer of lipids from one side to the other. Extrinsic proteins are on one side of the membrane. Cell surface markers. Cell surface markers are special proteins expressed on the surface of cells or carbohydrates attached to the cell membrane that often serve as signs of specific cell types. Role of plasma membrane. Plasma membrane is a dynamic structure only about 7 nanometers wide. It presents a barrier to the movement of ions and molecules. It prevents the aqueous contents of the cell from escaping. It helps to excrete waste substances, urea, uric acid, etc. It also secretes useful substances, hormones, enzymes, etc. Cell membrane generate the ionic gradients for nervous and muscular activity. It maintains a suitable pH and ionic concentration within